So good day, good people. Today I wanted to go over some of the requirements for our first written paper of the year. And in some ways this paper will be, I guess it allows you a little more freedom and a little more ability to use some of your creative writing. Other papers that we do will be focused around a central topic, but this one is much more narrative in scope. And the title of it is simply Remembering a Scene. So what I'm going to do is, I promised you, I go ahead and do the assignment along with you, so I understand kind of the problem areas that you come into, but also how much time it should take and that kind of stuff. And so what I want to do is, I've got a story that I'm writing from my past, my childhood, and I want to talk about an incident. And as you can kind of see, it's not overly long. It wound up taking me about 2.5 pages to complete. And that's one of the things in this assignment, the Remembering a Scene, as you're looking at it. I want you to think of a moment in your life that was pivotal. It didn't have to be earth-shattering, but it left an impression on you and definitely is something that you can remember. And so I've chosen a scene that's a fairly short scene, and I want you to do the same thing. It's not meant for you to write an entire book or memoir or autobiography about your experience. Instead, what I want you to do is think of it, if I can capture something that took place in about a 2 to 5 minute sequence of events, that would be perfect. And then through that event, I can reveal a little bit about myself and a little bit about why the situation was important to me. So along the way, what we're going to ask you to do is incorporate some of the outside readings that we've been doing, these short stories and essays that we've been looking at, where the writers are high quality writers, but they're using certain techniques that we want you to try to emulate. And that's how we improve our writing. It's not simply doing the same thing over and over again, but it's learning how other good writers write and how we can make use of some of their strategies and techniques. So let me read the story to you first, and then we'll go through kind of the nuts and bolts of the assignment. So this is one called The Only One in the Stands. Now, one of the things I want you to kind of identify with it, you'll notice I've done a heading, I've done a header. It's all double spaced. I've got my 1-inch margins all the way around. Okay, that was set up right from the beginning, and then we're good to go. All right, I'm using a very clean font. In this case, it's I believe it's Verdana that I've used on this one. All right, so here's the story. It was cold outside. The rain came down in sheets, not gently, but with a power and building rhythm that was a little frightening if you were 12 years old. Looking up against the floodlights of the stadium, tiny silver bullets of rain shifted uniformly in the wind like a school of fish turning in unison to the current. We left, my brothers, me, and my older sister, heading for the car, an old midnight blue Chevy Impala station wagon, parked in the distance near the exit in order to make leaving more convenient. As an engineer, my dad had a reason behind every choice, even innocuous ones like where to park the car. It was a long, wet walk in the chill night air. There was no possible way we were going to watch a football game under these conditions, even if it was my brother Michael's big game against rival Joliet Catholic. It was crazy to think the officials would keep the boys playing. Insane. My father didn't come with us when we retreated to the car. I don't actually believe that any of us thought he would. He never had before, so why should tonight's miserable weather conditions be any different? We waited in the car for about 45 minutes, barely able to discern the happenings on the field by the dull red and rain-blurred glow of the distant scoreboard. The rain slackened to a drizzle, and the squad decided to abandon our dry post and march back to the stadium. As we approached the stadium, the rain again began to pick up, accompanied by a stiff north breeze. I sprinted and slid up the ramp, turning to look up into the stands since we couldn't find my father under them. They were completely empty, except for a lone figure sitting on about the 45-yard line halfway up. That fan was my dad. I learned more about him that night than I had in my 12 previous years of life. I stood for a moment, getting soaked, staring at the sight, at the moment absorbing its weight. I write about the football game to get across who and what my father was to each one of us. If there's ever a time in my life when I begin to feel overwhelmed in the avalanche that life can sometimes become, and trust me, many times it has caught me unawares and unprepared, I think about the example my father led with his life. He is both strong and proud, of Italian and German blood, but also capable of quiet gentleness that simply cannot do him justice. This gentleness comes from a conviction that each one of his 8 children is a success. It's a belief we, as its target, have trouble believing ourselves. He measures his successes not through his eyes or his accomplishments, but through the eyes of each of his children and his uncanny sight to the small details of life that mark accomplishment but stay obscured from the sightlight of most. With all that said, he was a father, we as children. He was a father, and we, as children, often had trouble understanding. He was quiet and seemed to have an inestimable energy to work, getting up at 4 a.m. each day only to be found snoring in his recliner after dinner, still in a starched white work shirt without a tie. Frustratingly for my mother, he would exchange a new one for the one he wore to work each day, unconsciously doubling her ironing load. He could punish with a dramatic flair for the guilt trip, and he never seemed to know where anything ever was located in the house. "David, do you know where Mom keeps the forks?" To understand my dad, you must first understand the concepts of self-sacrifice, patience, understanding, optimism, hard work, and tolerance. I've never encountered anyone who embodies these qualities virtually every day of life as he has. It takes a special person to be able to stay consistently positive for an entire lifetime. It's easy in our world to take the easy way, avoid its puddles with a faint left or right and an easy penchant to quickly forget the trouble since we skillfully avoided it. Dad taught through multiple though painful examples that the easy way is not always the best way. Shame on the platitude, work smarter, not harder. My dad was on 24/7. In my dad's world and in mine, hard work paid off, not monetarily or materialistically, but where it mattered most, within the beating of your soul. I learned a great deal of my father that rainy Friday evening, and I know my siblings did as well. I just hope that I never forget and lose sight. Even a teacher can recognize a better instructor when one crossed his path. My father was and remains a great instructor, and I don't believe he will ever stop teaching me. It is my whispered prayer he never does. My focus returned to Victoria, my 17-year-old daughter, now running out onto the pitch to take her spot among her soccer sisters. I was not alone in the near-empty stadium, but it was beginning to thin out as the rain came down, making a dull pinging sound on the metal bleachers surrounding me on this bitter February evening. I smiled to myself and, strangely, didn't notice the cold. Okay, so this story begins with pre-writing, and that's what I want you to do with yours. And pre-writing can take all kinds of different forms. We're going to use a simple kind of webbing technique. And so you notice I started with an idea that I wanted to write something about my dad. And so I put him in the center of my paper. And then from that, I began to build out qualities or characteristics that he had. Okay? These are details that, like his cluelessness stuck out to me. He never seemed to know where anything was in the house because he basically didn't take care of the house. He worked, at a refinery most of his life. And so that's a detail I wanted to include in. So you'll see I branched out, and little by little, everything led to this area where there was a memorable football game that my older brother Michael played when we lived in Illinois against a team called Joliet Catholic. And that game stood out to me for a lot of reasons, and that's the story I wanted to tell in my paper. But from that story, I learned quite a bit, okay? So you can see, if you examine this, if you want to stop the tape, you can see I have a lot of details. Much of it I will not use, but much of it I will use. I've even pointed out, and that's what these boxes are for, these are pieces of the reading that I gathered from other stories. From Sarah Vowell's story about shooting dad, from George Orwell's A Hanging Story. These are things I wanted to include and emulate in my own writing. So this is also part of your assignment. What I want you to do, I call it like tracking the influence of the supplemental mentor readings. And what I want you to do with a couple of these readings is try to incorporate something you found. I found, I think, about 4 or 5 different ones to use. Everything from Genetic Engineering by David Sedaris, Shooting Dad by Sarah Vowell, A Hanging by George Orwell. And what I do is I take each of those sections and I identify what it is that I'm trying to imitate. So, for example, in the genetic engineering essay by David Sedaris, I like Sedaris's use of the parenthetical paragraph. That's where he puts these parentheses and adds almost what's called an aside. It's a side thought. And I thought that's kind of a neat writer's technique. I want to put that in there too. So I added that extra information. You'll see it in the original text highlighted in yellow. I also took some ideas from Shooting Dad and Genetic Engineering combined. I liked how both stories incorporated an event description with the main story. In other words, there's something deeper than just that little vignette I'm trying to tell. There's some story I want to get across about my dad, some meaning, and I want to use the vehicle of this little bitty episode to do that. Okay, so I liked how Sarah Val piled memories on top of each other, and if you read her essay, you'll see what I mean. And then finally, the hanging. I love the puddle scene from that one, where the prisoner steps out around the puddle. So in red type in the final, you'll see how I incorporated that idea of how we always try to avoid puddles. It's something human. We don't like big messes. We like to kind of get to where things are clean. And so you can take a look at these and see how they're worked out inside my essay. And then last but not least, what I want you to do is you're going to be taking care of a sentence model, and I'm going to give you one as an example later, but I want you to highlight that and explain to me how it's there. So look for a video and an explanation during the Zoom sessions of where I go over that information. And then last but not least, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and do some kind of like peer review where they have a checklist. Do they notice you doing this? And this will be the final piece in all of our papers. You'll get a checklist to make sure you completed all the items that are there. All right, so good luck. This video hopefully will explain. Sorry for its length, but I think we needed to take that time to be able to go through the assignment completely.